Good afternoon and welcome to the PACE Central Chapter webinar, Taking Your Compliance Program to the Next Level. My name is Marjorie Gardfrey, and I am the Vice President of Business Development for PACE and will be your moderator for today. As we get ready to begin, there are a few housekeeping items that I'd like to inform you of. The 2016 PACE National Convention and Expo is being held April 3rd through the 6th at the Rosen Shingle Creek in Orlando, Florida. Early bird registration will begin soon, and you can find out more details on the PACE website. That's www.paceassociation.com. Also, registration for the CECP, or Customer Engagement Compliance Professional Certification, is open. The two-day live training will take place immediately following convention on April 6th through the 7th with the April 8th exam. This webinar is being recorded. All lines are muted to avoid background noise. If you have any questions, please be sure to type it into the chat box in your lower left-hand corner of your screen. And also, a couple of members of the PACE Central Chapter Board are joining us for support today, Michael Thompson and Rebecca Carr. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Reid Hauser is the Global Director of Compliance for Sitel Corporation, located in Omaha, Nebraska. Sitel has 56,000 associates which operate in 23 countries worldwide. Mr. Hauser has worked in the teleservices industry for 11 years and has more than 24 years of regulatory compliance experience. He also leads Sitel's global telemarketing, do not call, and privacy compliance efforts. He's responsible for ensuring compliance with all federal, state, and provincial rules that impact Sitel and its clients globally. From do not call to state privacy issues, Mr. Hauser leads both internal and external clients through the maze of regulatory issues and works to find solutions to meet their needs. Reid is also the chair of PACE's Compliance Officers Forum, or COF, and the 2008 recipient of the prestigious Fulcrum Award for his outstanding contributions to teleservices industry, the highest award PACE bestows. He is also the past chapter president of PACE's Midwest chapter. Go ahead, take it away, Reid.
Thank you very much, Marjorie, and welcome everybody to the call. Look forward to our discussion today. With that, let's move on to our topics that we're going to discuss today. And if we move to slide 3, we're going to talk about compliance department priorities, best practices for, well, it should be 2016. TCPA, there's some breaking news that I wanted to share with everybody. We're going to talk about some privacy issues, data breach, and we're going to touch on some ethic issues as we go through today's call. So with that, let's go on to the slide 6, and we'll get right into our discussion. So every compliance officer wants to understand the state of their ethics and compliance program, but doing a complete program assessment may not be feasible for every organization. I mean, just basically due to the budget constraints, staffing constraints, or just your personal bandwidth. You just don't have the time to do it. However, there are some things that you can do to increase, to do that review without an increase to budget or an add to staff. You can simply start by taking a step back from all the emails, all the phone calls, all the meetings, if you can find some time in your day, to take a few minutes to figure out what you're missing. Because it's usually the things that you think are covered or you didn't know maybe were out there that'll catch you off guard. So one place to start is identifying your biggest risks. This could be anything from not reviewing every outbound script to I just got a call from the dialer team that one of our sites loaded 500,000 leads they bought off an internet lead provider and loaded them to dialer and have been making unsolicited pre-recorded telephone calls to wireless devices since last week. So in our current regulatory environment, that could be pretty risky business to be in. So So what are our risks? What are our biggest risks? Well, these are some ideas that I put down here. What are my biggest compliance risks? What are my biggest regulatory risks? What are my biggest client or customer risks? What are my risk drivers? And what are our risk drivers? I've identified, at least for today's callers, are those things that allow or make risk possible. They could be such thing as a lack of or no policy regarding a particular activity, or you don't have a defined process on how to deal with certain issues. Those are risk drivers. Another things that can lead to impacting our priorities are budget, management support, and staffing needs. In my years when I've been doing compliance, these are always seem to be the main things that come up year after year that have an impact on our priorities. So for each risk you have, it's always important to define what that risk is, identify the likely impact for that risk, and how likely it is to happen. Document and define your risk. Develop a risk scale. If you have a risk scale that's 1 to 5, how do you determine what's a 1 and what's a 5? You got to document what those risk levels are. It's not a good idea to be arbitrary when developing a risk scale. One thing that I did, since we're a large global player, what I did is I broke down by country. So I did a country risk analysis. I did a business risk analysis, the business that we're actually doing in those countries. Then identified the rules and regulations that apply to that business. It did some research on the regulators, how active they were, what kind of fines are possible, and then assigned a risk scale based on all the information that I gathered. And then I put a heat map together so upper management can easily see what the most risky not only risky clients, but what the most risky countries were. So that high-level map allowed us to build a roadmap on what we needed to address first. So if we go on to the next slide there, Michael. So the compliance departments plan to improve. We talked about taking our compliance department to the next level. Well, I know how it is. Working day to day, you're putting out fires, you're taking phone calls, you're in meetings, and you have about an hour and a half, if you're lucky, to get some work done each day. But if you're going to take your compliance department to the next level, you have to set aside some time and develop a plan for improvement. We talked about risks, so you need to, one of the things is you need to rank your risks and your priorities. The plan you should develop should be based on the company priorities and your risk assessment. What are your company's business priorities, and what are you currently doing, and what are you planning to do? Compliance needs to partner with the business side and not be at odds with it. I fully understand. Working with different functions in our company. I have to be a team player with IT, operations, the sites, sales, marketing. All those come into play, even our HR departments, because compliance touches every aspect of the business. So you have to join and make partners with your business, with the different business silos in your company. So assign the risk, develop a timeline for your plan, and then sell your plan to management. And
Reid?
You're really marketing your plan to the upper management because you'll need their buy-in. And this is I'm not a sales guy, so for me it's a little bit hard to do this. But I'm going to give you some ideas that have worked for me in the past. So these are selling points that I've used. So compliance provides stability for revenue. If you were investigated or audited, that takes time and money. And fines, if you get a fine, that goes straight to the bottom line. We're still on slide 7. Compliance uncovers errors, issues that need to be corrected before they become huge problems. That's what we're there for, is to mitigate risk to the company. Compliance allows continued service to clients because of the reduction of fines and penalties and impact to your reputation in the marketplace, which is a huge issue, especially in today's social media. If companies get fined, the information flies out across both the news services and take what happened to Target. That had a huge impact on their business when they had a deep data breach. Compliance needs to better learn how to have a better relationship with regulators. One thing that is hard to do, and that is measure how much money compliance saves the company each year. Most companies in upper management see compliance as a cost center, as a have to, as a need to more than a want to. So it's selling them on the fact that you're protecting their bottom line and getting their buy-in and support, which is huge.
Reid?
Making a budget and, like I said, selling it to management. Request everything. Write out your list the things that you need, but then make sure you have your list of must-haves. Unless in most cases you're probably not going to get everything, but if you have your list of must-haves, you can scale back to those things that you have to have. And then start your plan. Start at the top and work down. What's the most risk that you need to address first, and then go from there. And then develop regular and ongoing practices to address those. On slide 8, compliance
Reid?
department effectiveness.
Reid, we have a question.
Sure.
Question is, in reference to the prior slide, the question popped up. When you're trying to measure your effectiveness and really make sure that you're getting buy-in from upper management, how would you recommend, or could you talk a minute about how you should construct your compliance assessment team, or the people within the organization that should review the effectiveness of your compliance program?
Right. So all of your effectiveness is going to be based on whether or not you're meeting goals, whether or not you're meeting not only your compliance goals but company goals. So part of that is reaching out to your customers, and I mentioned those earlier. Customers could be your IT, your HR, your sales team, your operations, your site teams. Are you being effective and meeting the goals? Compliance is not just about saying no. It's finding solutions on how to comply with the various laws. If your compliance department, all you do is say no, then you're not meeting your clients' needs, because we need to provide solutions to help them. So part of that effectiveness is really measured on how are we finding solutions to meet those needs and addressing the concerns, but not only of our internal customers but our external clients as well. So that's one way, and one way you could do surveys. You can do measurements as far as training. These are basic things, but you could do things, for example, measuring your effectiveness on number of people trained, how many issues were addressed and resolved, how many things were caught early and addressed. All those things could be measured and put into a spreadsheet or a PowerPoint and presented. Surveys are another great way to do that, is just surveying your internal customers, like I mentioned before, to get their feedback. That's always important, because, again, building those relationships and building that rapport with them goes a long ways in meeting the needs.
Excellent. Thank you.
Welcome. So, again, compliance effectiveness. Is your program effective? Are you meeting the goals? Are you meeting upper management expectations? Are you meeting your customer, both internal and external customer needs? Determine how to measure your effectiveness, and we just kind of touched on these a little bit with the question, but the number of program goals completed, management expectations met, and again, these can all be documented and put into a report. Number of employees trained, issues addressed, risk areas that were addressed before they were became bigger issues. So on slide 9, we're going to move into a next piece of the discussion. We're going to talk about compliance maturity, and take a look at these categories. And I've got 4 down here that I've identified on how to measure your compliance department maturity. The first one is substandard. It's management by escalation. We're not meeting policies, client contracts, or regulatory requirements. This is basically compliance by disaster. We're just meeting the latest fire. We're not proactive by any means. It's just a reactionary type of compliance effort. Another one is ad hoc, which is an unacceptable approach to compliance. Is typical policy. We have typical policies, client contracts, and regulatory requirements for specific escalation, reaction to negative report or upcoming audit, then developing practices to meet those issues. So it's really reactionary in its nature. Meeting minimum policy is reactive, meeting the bare minimums of policy and contract regulatory compliance. Typically still reactive, but not planning and causing spikes in management or resources. Not embedded into the business as usual process. Often need other functions to remind management of the status. So they focus on a topic. Reacting to reports, audits, limited operational management. And then the last one is the proactive. It's having processes, policies in place that are being documented, being communicated, and you have buy-in from upper management and your partners. And partners, again, could be IT, it could be HR, whoever the other areas that would help support. This is the cheapest to operate. It reduces reactive management and resourcing. It's embedded into the business as usual and part of the company's DNA. Continuous improvement, proactive risk and compliance management. This is where departments need to be. It's staying a step ahead of what's going on in the company. It's being embedded into the process, so you're part of the business and not an isolated department off to the side. It's interacting with the new business. It's interacting with the upper management, so that when they're doing their strategic planning, you're a part of that, so you know where the company's going, and you have an opportunity to provide feedback to them and guidance from the get-go. So if they decide they want to start a new program or start a new direction, you're right there to help provide that guidance and direction and build systems and processes, policies, procedures, whatever it needs to be, and have them in place before you actually get there. So on to the next category. So that's the maturity level. The next slide, we're going to talk about risk assessment. And this is one of those things that, and we touched on earlier, but this is one of those things that is imperative, in my mind, to take your compliance department to the next level. Because if you don't know what your risks are, how are you going to address them? If you've never done a risk assessment, it doesn't have to be fancy, it doesn't have to be expensive, and you don't have to have a third party. It's really, if you have a team, or if if you're the only one in your department, you can put a team together to help identify risks. You can get players from the different functions in your company to come together to help you put together a list of risks that the company faces, and address those. So the scope of the analysis, what are you going to review? Data collection, systems, processes, equipment, facilities, and the list goes on. And I told you the one I did started off. I did it country level, broke it down by the business we do in there, broke it down by the types of products, et cetera, that we're selling in those countries, identified the laws, and so on. So you don't necessarily have to do that in depth of one, but depending upon the scale of your operation and the scale of what your compliance requirements are going to be, you may need to. Identify and document potential threats and vulnerabilities. I can't emphasize this enough, is that whatever you do from a compliance perspective, document it. Write it down, save your files. If you're doing a risk assessment this year and you refresh it at the beginning, on an annual basis, make sure you keep the legacy risk assessments that you've done so you have your documentation. And it also helps you establish a baseline to show you where you were and where you are today. So you can take a look back to see where you've come from and the improvements that have been made, which is another selling point to upper management, by the way, on the need for compliance and more resources. Determine the likelihood of a threat occurrence. Make the threat scale high, medium, low. Again, we talked about making sure we documenting this, having this measurable and not arbitrary. So it can be applied across the board, and more people than just you can use your risk assessment because you've documented how you determine what a risk is and what is a high risk and what a low risk is. Determine the potential impact of the threat. Is it very likely? Is it somewhat likely? Is it not very likely? Again, documented process that can be replicated. Determine the risk level. The risk level could be determined, for example, by analyzing the values assigned to the likelihood of a threat occurring and resulting impact of the threat. And I told you I made a heat map. Red, amber, green is very simple, very quick way to see where your higher risks are at. Finalize, build, and execute your risk management plans to address the high risk issues first. It's picking off those things that need to be addressed right off the bat and get them handled and addressed so they don't become larger. And then do a periodic review. I told you, as I mentioned earlier, keeping those legacy reports just as a baseline so that you can see where you've come from, what you still need to work on in the future. Go on to training. This is another issue, and I know that we've talked about this in the past, but can't emphasize enough to make sure that that the employees are being trained. And I put down here from the boardroom to the mailroom, and document and track your training, making training a regular and ongoing part of your business. People don't know what to comply with; they can't comply with it. So it's the compliance department's job to make sure they know what laws apply and what their responsibilities are as those rules apply to them and their job. Examples of training, and these are just some examples. I put down live and e-learning, manager-led, burst learning. This is actually one I've heard about in the last couple years. And what they are videoettes. They're just 4 or 5 minutes or 5 to 7 minute videos that you can put together and either email or put on a SharePoint site or a web page that people can access. That you're always getting your message out and reminders out to these videos. More people I think like to watch a video than they do read. So it's just another idea to get their attention and to get your message out. And then group discussions and collaborative learning and social networking. Yes, Michael.
Cool. We have another question. The question is, why do you think it's important to have everyone trained? Specifically, it was revolving around the bullet, ensure everyone's trained from the boardroom to the mailroom. Could you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good question. So everybody in the company has a compliance responsibility. Just because you wear the label of compliance officer doesn't mean you're the only person in the company that bears that responsibility. Everybody bears the responsibility of compliance, even in the mailroom. So you're asking, well, what regulations apply to them? Well, let me put it this way. If you're doing, for example, security awareness training, and maybe the mailroom was going to receive packages or letters or envelopes. Well, what if there's some strange or weird packages that come in with white powder on them? They need to be trained on how to handle those issues so that package does not pose a threat to everybody else in the building. So, and at the boardroom level, those people need to know and understand all of the laws that apply to the business, and maybe not have necessarily a working knowledge of every one of those laws, but they need to understand what the law is and what the impact of the law is, so that they can have a working knowledge of what the requirements are. Does that answer your question, Michael?
It does. Thanks.
On to awareness, compliance awareness. And we talked about training. Well, what's the difference between training and awareness? Training may be annual. It may be quarterly. Awareness is continuous. So keeping compliance on everybody's mind. It's not compliance training is not a once and done thing, and compliance is not a once and done thing. You just don't put a program together and walk away. It's keeping compliance on everybody's mind in the company. And I've put down some ideas here about at the bottom, magnets, posters, press releases, games, pens, and so on. These are all just some ideas of continually keeping your message out there about compliance. If you've got call centers, these are great ideas to keep the compliance on the forefront of their mind as they're talking on the phone with your clients, because really, in many cases, the phone agents are on the front line of your compliance department and your compliance efforts, because they're the ones interacting with the consumer. They're the ones taking the initial complaints. They're the ones who are reading the scripts. So those folks need to know what the requirements are and what's expected of them from a compliance perspective. Awareness helps keep that on their mind, on a regular basis. Automation, automated tools work by taking your policies and procedures and implementing them into control points. So, for example, if you're operating on a thin budget, which maybe you are, maybe you aren't, but in different places that I've worked, the compliance budget hasn't been, let's just put it this way, it hasn't been one of the top 10 budget resources in the company. So the more automated you can make your processes and your compliance work, the better off you are. Number one, you can do more with less. Two, you'll probably catch more things having an automated process than you would if you didn't have something in place. So automation helps you take your processes, your monitoring, reporting, those types of things, automate them automate those so that you have tools that you're using to make sure that compliance is happening in the company. Look for ideas, be creative with how you can monitor things. For example, I have about 27 reports that I get on a daily basis, and they're all exception reports. And what an exception report, it just shows me if there's an issue. It doesn't show me, I have all the details if I want to look at it, but what this does is I've set these reports up so that it just shows me any errors or any deviations from from what the parameters are I put in those reports. So I can monitor our dialers, and I don't have to go through each one of our dialers to make sure that it's been compliant, that we're outpulsing caller ID, that the abandonment rate is correct, etc., because I've built reports to help me monitor those activities. I've got standardized training monitoring or tracking tools that I put together. So I get reports on a weekly basis for all the training that happens that I'm responsible for. So our telemarketing training, our privacy and security awareness training, all gets rolled up into a report, so I can break it down by site to see who's taken and who hasn't taken the training. So just some thoughts on automating your processes, which makes you more effective. And from those, you can then build reports for upper management, for example. Again, communicating what you're doing. And I can't emphasize that enough, because if upper management doesn't know what you're doing, you're not being effective in selling them on your processes. It's always keeping them aware of what you're doing, what you've caught, what you've done to correct it, and how you're going to prevent it from happening again. So management support, communication importance. And I've been talking about this, I guess, quite a bit today, but it is very important. Management and board of directors believe that compliance and ethics are an integral part of the company's culture. That's where you want to be. It's getting that tone at the top, that support at the top, to help you and your compliance department be a success. Clear and consistent limits on acceptable behavior. No marginalization of the compliance and ethics of the department. I worked in one company, was on a group meeting of about 200 individuals, and the SVP gets on and says, "Oh, we got the compliance guy here today." Well, that's not very supportive, especially when you're talking to that many people in your company. So you want to have that support, and they need to understand the value, of what you bring to the table. That you're protecting revenue, you're protecting reputation, you're protecting client base, and that's really what you're doing through all the activities that you bring to the table. Integrate compliance in the business operations. I've talked about this, touched on this a little bit, but this is really a key importance in building relationships within your company, but also staying on the forefront of what's happening in your company. So compliance and ethics teams must understand how their roles fit into the big picture. Again, I mentioned earlier, you can't be an isolated department off in the corner somewhere. You have to be visible. You have to be out there. You have to be building relationships with everybody in the different functions within your company, so that you can stay in tune with what's happening in the company. Business and compliance should collaborate on projects. On business projects, clients, and customer programs to ensure processes and programs are in compliance from the beginning. How many times have you had somebody come to you, or you find out about something that's been going on for several months or a month or so, and it's a clear violation of the rules? I mean, I've had that happen before, and then you have to go back, and in some cases you have to go back to the client. That can be embarrassing. So and that's some of the talking points you can use when you're talking with the business side, is that if you keep me involved from the beginning, we can reduce time, cost, and embarrassment with our clients by just getting these programs set up correctly on the front end. And I mentioned this, and I want to cover this last point here. Good compliance programs don't just say no. Good compliance programs find solutions on how to legally comply with the rules, establish expectations for how employees should conduct themselves, promote good corporate citizenship, identify high-risk areas, prevent, detect potential violations of the rules. And if you want to sum it up, that's the goal.
Reid, we have another question.
Sure.
What do you do when you feel there isn't a culture of cooperation for compliance within your executive team? How do you cross that barrier?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, Michael. And I actually worked at a company several years ago where the CFO, or CEO rather, was promoted from the sales team and never liked compliance. So I had a challenge on my hands on educating not only him but the executive team on the necessity for compliance. And if we work in the teleservice or any other industry, there's more and more regulations every day. So what I did is began educating them on what the risks are if we're not compliant, and finally got the support of our general counsel. General counsel helped me be a voice on the executive team to implement the processes we needed. But it's really working with the team and educating them, and they just may not know. Or maybe they've had a bad experience in the past with compliance because there was a guy out there that all they did was say no and didn't provide solutions. So, there's several things that you can do. Again, educate, provide information, but you can't not do your job. That's the key, is you can't not do your job. You still have the responsibility to make sure that the company is compliant, and it can be tough. But again, you can work through it. I know it took me a few months to finally get to the position where I got support, and then from that, I've got set up meetings with the internal audit. The audit committee began reporting to them, so that it became oversight and life became better. But you can work through it.
Thanks.
Let's move on to the TCPA. If you have been on any one of the myriad of webinars over the last couple months, this should be fairly familiar topic to you. And the reason I put it in today is because there is some more breaking news, which we'll get to in just a second. But this has a huge impact on our industry. If you make any outbound type of calls or making callbacks from inbound calls, the new TCPA rules really do impact you. One of the things, and again, the reason I put this in here is one of the reasons that I put it in today is because on most of the calls that I've been a part of, they talk about the rule, they talk about what the FCC did, they talk about litigation, but they really don't go over what we need to do to comply. And so I thought we'd touch on some of those things today, some best practices on how to comply with the new TCPA environment, and then maybe answer some questions as we go through. But the breaking news is, and this just happened just last week, the Budget Act was passed, which had some TCPA changes in it. In addition to the exemption for applicable calls made to cellular phones, the Act also exempts certain calls to residential lines. So what the law did is exempt calls to both wireless numbers and residential lines for pre-recorded messages for debt collection purposes where debt is either owned or guaranteed by the United States government. So it carved out a small portion of debt collection calls that you can use pre-recorded messages to both landlines and wireless devices without having prior consent. So I know there's I don't know if you've heard about this, but I wanted to make sure that we did touch on this a little bit during our conversation today. So on down to the declaratory ruling from July 10th. The FCC declaratory ruling, which came out on Friday, July 10th, impacts the following activities. And Michael, if you want to advance the slide. Calls to wireless devices using ATDS, and the ATDS, for those, just as a reminder, is automatic telephone dialing system. They changed the definition of what an ATDS to make it very broad, which could include your smartphone, and basically anything that's not a rotary phone is really what it boils down to. In fact, even one of the commissioners during the hearing said that the ruling really the only compliant method for making an outbound call to a wireless device is using a rotary dial phone. So I don't know if you've been on eBay or Amazon buying your rotary dial phones or not, but really that's the kind of the world we live in now. Calling numbers that have been reassigned. There is a one-call safe harbor, and we can talk about that a little bit. Calling consumers that have revoked consent. Text messages. Basically, the TCPA says that a text is the same as a phone call. And then there was a few limited exemptions that pertain to healthcare and financial-related calls. And basically, what they were related to was appointments for healthcare, and if there was a data breach for the financial services calls. So on down to the next slide, the automated telephone dialing system. I'm just going to cover this real quickly because I know that probably most of you, if not all of you, have probably been on one or more TCPA-related webinars, and I don't want to rehash too much old ground, but just to set a base for our conversation today. So again, TPCA rulings cover the equipment as far as what an ATDS and the potential capacity that applies. The ATDS now applies to anything that has the current or future capacity to dial. So if you can make modifications to an ATDS either through software or hardware, it could be considered an ATDS. Again, that's to automatically dial telephone numbers without human intervention. So if you we're going to get into some best practices in just a couple minutes on what we can do to identify that. We talked about rotary phones. And also express written consent, obtaining written consent from consumers to call them for marketing purposes, and prior express consent for all other calls using an ATDS to calls made to wireless devices. On slide 21, some best practices. So if you're using a dialer or a system to launch calls, even if it's a desk phone and you have a switch, calls are going through a switch, you need to analyze that switch, because if the switch can be modified through software or hardware upgrades, it could be considered an ATDS. So that again, it's not just the normal dialer we think of. It could also include your switches that you're launching calls with, or any other system or process that you may be using to launch those calls. So what I recommend doing is identifying all the methods that calls are made from, whether it be from a desk phone or they're loaded to a dialer or some type of system to be made. And you need to analyze those systems, and you'll probably need the help of IT or a third-party vendor, depending upon what systems you have. And again, we talked about documentation. This is where you want to document everything. It's highly important that you document the information that you gather from these. If you determine that that your system or the process that you're using currently can be modified, you need to document that, and then look for alternate means to make calls. Even if the changes are expensive, they still could be considered an ATDS. There's no dollar amount limits that were mentioned in the ruling that would preclude a system from being considered an ATDS just because it was too expensive to do. So just some thoughts. Again, document your findings, and in some cases you may need to seek legal advice. And if you're going to use a system, an electronic system to launch calls, I would highly recommend seeking outside counsel to get an opinion on that system before you start making calls to wireless devices without consent. The next slide, best practices, training the sites and agents to listen to the call party. And we're talking here mainly about revoking consent, etc. What the rules said, the Commission said that consumers can revoke consent by any means. So if is a do not call request now revoking consent? Well, probably. So if the consumer says, "Don't call me, I don't want to be called anymore," those types of phrases, then that probably is not only a internal do not call request, but it's also revocation of consent. That if you're working on behalf of other clients, you're making calls on their behalf, you need to notify them that consumer just revoked consent through that internal do not call request. So some things to keep in mind, and again, that goes to training, documentation of the request, and communicating those to all parties that need to know. Ensuring call lists are up to date and current. Reassign numbers. So are you sure that the lead list you're calling is current? If so, how do you know? When was the last time that the phone number was confirmed? Do you have a process currently built into your scripting to ensure that the person you're talking to is actually the person that you dialed? Is there some authorization or verification process in your scripting to ensure that's the right party? Again, there's a one call safe harbor, and after that, there's nothing. So dialing wrong, document wrong numbers. Just part of the documentation process and keeping your lists up to date. Third-party resources to identify or reassign numbers. I know that there are some services out there that are offering that. Change to keep current with your customer. It is a challenge to keep current with your customers. And we talked about, again, having something built into your scripting to help you with that process, and then documenting the last contact you had with that phone number to make sure that, again, that when we talked to them in March, it was correct. So, those types of things to help keep your clients in compliance and your company. And the last slide on the TCPA best practices, alert and educate corporate leaders, train your sites and agents, manual dialing, reassign numbers, consent revocation, updating contact lists, just like we talked about, developing compliance and monitoring reports, developing vendor standards. If you're using a third-party vendor to make outbound calls, make sure that you're monitoring that vendor, that you're doing regular reviews, that they're providing you certain metric back on what they're doing for you, and making sure that they stay in compliance with not only the federal laws but the state laws as well. That can be all part of your contract and SOW that you sign with that third-party vendor. Notify your clients, sign, again, amended agreements if need to be, scrub wireless numbers, and use alternate dialing methods. If you're unsure whether or not the system that you're using is an ATDS or not, is it worth the risk? $16,000 in fines per call, and $500 for each call where there is an individual could go after your firm for that. So $500 may not sound like too much until you multiply that times 5,000 calls, and it adds up quite fast. Ensure your manual dialing process complies with, again, call time restrictions, caller ID, do not call list, and agent monitoring. So, the beautiful thing about having a dialer is a lot of the compliance processes can be built right into the process, where you can get abandonment rates, you can get caller IDs, you're assured that caller ID is being outpulsed, call time restrictions are built in, all your DNC processes are associated with that, where they may not be on a manual dial process. So that's where it's important to keep that in mind as you move to, if you move to a manual dial process. Any questions on the TCPA, Michael?
Nope, no questions yet on that.
Okay. All right. Well, let's go on to the privacy. As you know, privacy has been probably one of the things that's most publicized in recent months and years. There has been an increase in data breaches. In fact, there was a huge data breach that was announced earlier this week for some financial institutions here in the U.S., some banks. There was massive data breach, where from what I understand, and I haven't researched this, but what I heard on the news was that an individual gave out their username and password. They were able to use that username and password from a vendor to get into this bank's system, and from there they were able to hack the system and access millions of bank records. So privacy is a huge issue. If you work internationally, privacy laws, for example, in Europe, Central and South America, Asia, are all establishing European-style data protection laws. In fact, in the U.S., there are more than 3,000 privacy laws that have been enacted, both at the state and federal level. The FTC is now taking it upon themselves to be the privacy regulator in the U.S. And if you're familiar with the Wyndham case, that really brought that to the forefront. So there's been a dramatic increase in privacy. So if privacy is under your preview from a compliance perspective, educate yourself on what you need to do, because there are a lot of rules out there that need to be applied to. Develop a privacy program. Let's go on to the next slide. The safe harbor BCR issue. I don't know if you do business internationally, safe harbor was declared inadequate or invalid earlier this year. So you can no longer rely on the safe harbor to transfer personal information from Europe into the U.S. So if you're not aware of that, then you need to make sure that you have put in place either developing the BCR, binding corporate rules, or you're getting model contracts signed both with vendors and clients to make sure that you can legally transfer data from the EU into the U.S. Binding corporate rules can be a large project, but it's probably one of the better ways to ensure compliance with the EU standards of data privacy. So what's new? And I told you, this is the next slide that I mentioned earlier, the FTC and the Wyndham case. Is hugely impactful for everyone. Basically, what the FCC is done with this case is they're making it, if you have a breach, they're basically saying that they're going to come after you from the unfair acts and practices perspective, and say that because you were breached, your policies were unfair and deceptive, and then they'll go after you from that angle. That's what they did with Wyndham, and Wyndham really got taken to the woodshed on the data breach that they had, and the FCC basically came in on that premise that there were unfair acts and practices that they had used and fined them for those violations. And I'm not going to spend. I know we're getting close on time, and so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this case, but I highly encourage you to look this case up. And again, this applies not only to your clients, but to your privacy program as well, internal. I mentioned earlier the EU-style data privacy laws are being implemented globally. Mexico, Colombia, Philippines, India, China, Hong Kong, all over Europe, obviously, Australia, New Zealand, all have EU-style data protection laws, and I've just named a few. So if you're doing business, externally, make sure you check those data privacy laws, and whether or not you need to obtain consent to transfer data across borders. U.S. privacy style is a little bit different. We have a more regulated on a business level rather than a global level. So, if you're operating in healthcare, HIPAA is going to come into play. If you're, all the data, most states have data breach rules and reporting rules that need to be complied with. So again, it's very important to develop not only the privacy policy but a program to make sure that you're compliant with the various privacy laws. So what does that look like? I'll cover it real quickly. And in this next slide is do an assessment of where you're at. Identify your third parties. Identify the systems that are used to transfer, store, process personal information. Personal devices that are connected to your system. Physical data storage. Do you have a shed out back where your HR folders are stored? It happens. I've talked to a friend of mine who was doing an assessment and found out that they thought all their physical documents were stored with third party in a safe, secure location. They found one site that they had an old shed out back where they'd been putting files. That's a true story. So making sure that all those locations are storing data in a secure manner. Some may need to be encrypted depending upon the type of data it is. Data flow mapping of PII. What systems, where does that data flow? Is it crossing borders? All those are important in compliance. Data privacy policies and procedures, global, through your internet. Having a data privacy policy is important, but is having one for the internet and then one policies and procedures that you communicate internally. Data privacy officer, you may need to your privacy needs may require that you have a separate and distinct privacy officer associated with your program. Cross-border data transfer, even transferring data from Canada to the U.S., there are laws that regulate that, and from Mexico into the U.S. So there are consent requirements and notification requirements that need to be complied with. Training. I highly recommend that you develop privacy training that's regular and ongoing. What that means is having at least annually, and maybe sooner if required. Intercompany agreements. Again, we talked about the model contracts for a European basis. You may have to have intercompany agreements in order to transfer data. Consent and data owner rights, depending upon the country and on the type of data that you're transferring or processing. You may have to obtain consent for that transfer. And then management review and approval. It's always important to make sure that you get upper management review, approval, and support for your data privacy program. And I'm going to very quickly cover some ethics program highlights because I know that we are almost out of time. So just quick highlights for the ethics program. If you don't have an ethics program, if you don't have ethics on your preview right now, highly recommend that you look into developing and implementing an ethics program, which could, at a minimum, have a business ethics policy and code of conduct and code of conduct training that is implemented in your firm. At a minimum, if you don't have those things, highly recommend that you do. And on the very last slide, I put together some points on and guidelines for managing an ethics program. And I'm sorry, Michael. I guess the time got away from me. The hour sure went fast.
Well, we still have a couple of minutes left. Thank you, Reid, for sharing that. We'd like to open up the floor if we have any additional questions that we'd like to go ahead and pose. You can type them in your chat window or pass them on via email. So we'll go ahead and open up for a couple moments on that. All right. Well, I'm not seeing any responses yet. Reid, you must be particular. Oh, here we go. Here's a question. Will we get a copy of these slides sent to us?
So we will have available the slides along with the recording by Tuesday of next week on the 17th on the PACE website.
Thank you, Kara Batts. What other questions? Okay, no additional questions, so I'll turn things back over to Madhuri if you want to wrap us up.
Yeah, we can do that. So thanks all for attending today's webinar, and unless there are further questions or concerns or anything of that sort, you can go ahead and send them directly to contact@paceassociation.com. We'll get them over to Reid and Michael to get you the best possible answers in the fastest amount of time that we can. And from PACE National and PACE Central Chapter, you guys have a great day.